The Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation is dedicated to exploring topics of national and international importance and is proud to support Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff at the University of Maryland. From the University of Maryland, this is Policy Watch with Doug Besheroff. The 2000 presidential election raised many questions about how Americans should elect their commander-in-chief. Critics of the voting system suggested everything from eliminating the Electoral College to requiring full public financing of federal elections. But in the 2004 election, candidates George W. Bush and John Kerry faced ballooning campaign spending accounts, questions of voting irregularities, and an electorate split almost evenly between the Republican and Democratic parties. Can America fix the voting system before the next presidential election? Are the days of an easy presidential victory gone for good? To find out, Policy Watch is joined this week by Dan Balz, national political correspondent for The Washington Post, and co-author of Deadlock, the inside story of America's closest election. And now, the host of Policy Watch, Doug Besheroff.
Dan Balz, you've covered a number of presidential elections, including the one in 2000 and the one in 2004. And you wrote a book with your colleagues, Deadlock, the inside story of America's closest elections.
Right.
How long could this have gone on if the Supreme Court hadn't, for good or bad, said stop?
Well, it would have gone on, and probably could have gone on to the House of Representatives. So we would not still be dealing with it, but it could have gone on for some extended period after that. And then I think both sides were prepared to take that fight as long and as far and as hard as it needed to go until there was, a decisive decision.
And in the House, there was the way the voting goes, it would have been a Bush victory.
Yes, it would have been a Bush victory in the House. That's right.
What do you do when people have not voted the way they intended to vote, or can't be counted that way? And I don't think anyone's come up with an answer to that.
Well, I don't know. And I'm not sure you can come up with an answer to that, Doug. I mean, the reality is the election process in this country is a human and flawed process. I mean, there are mistakes that are made in every election. I have no doubt about that. And the reality is, for this election system to work, people have to have faith in it. And for the most part, people do have faith in it. But when you look at it very closely, as we all did in Florida for those 36 or 37 days, you realize, things go wrong. And certainly what happened down there was that there were a lot of people who I think thought they were voting for Al Gore, who in one way or another didn't end up having votes counted for Al Gore. And that's what has created a desire to try to clean this up if you can, and to have essentially a zero tolerance for mistakes, which is a very high standard.
Very high. When I was a much younger person, I was a poll watcher in New York City for John Lindsay, and I was up in the South Bronx. The polls opened, and all the party regulars came and voted. And after they voted, the machines broke. And they were broken for the rest of the day. So I took another lesson from this, which is if we don't want these problems, one side or the other has to win big. Because
right.
Otherwise, this is...
Right. In any close election, you're going to run into these disputes.
And that's what's so worrisome to some people, because we seem to be a 50-50 nation. I suppose the first question is, are we a 50-50 nation?
Well, we're close to a 50-50 nation. I think the last two elections suggest that we may be at 50.5 to 40, 9.5 or 51, 49 or something in that direction. That there is, that under George W. Bush, the country has pushed a little away from pure parity to something that gives the Republicans a slight advantage, but very slight in terms of a presidential race.
But a presidential race isn't it a little different from sort of the politics of the nation? My impression is, on a straight Republican-Democratic matchup with no people, no human beings, no face to it, the country is a little bit more Republican than 51-49 or whatever. And it's the candidates who can bring these numbers closer together or further apart. Have I got that wrong?
Well, I don't know that I would. I think I would put it a little bit differently. I mean, I think you're basically right, but I think what I would say is that the country is sort of at 46, 46, and then another 7 or 8 that moves around a little bit. Certainly, we have a more polarized country and a country in which the two parties are at greater sense of parity than we've seen in our lifetimes and before that. But I think that the Republicans do have some structural advantage at this point. That for Democrats to win national elections, threading the needle is what they have to do. Republicans seem to have more options in terms of how you win, and I think that's because there is a little bit more solid Republican base in the country than Democratic.
Well, I think that you'll know the numbers better than I, but I think that since Lyndon Johnson was president, I think the average total vote for Democrats in a presidential election has hovered around 44 or 45%.
It's somewhere in that range. And now, part of that is you have 2 elections in which Clinton won, but you had Ross Perot on the ballot, and Perot took 19% the first year, and about half of that in 1996. So the Democratic vote, Clinton would have been above 50% in one or both of those elections had Perot not been on the ballot. But nonetheless, your point is right, that the Democrats have not won a majority of the national vote in a presidential election since Johnson.
Bill Clinton, in part, won because he was able to get those extra votes. He was able to look, he called himself a New Democrat, and he was able to look as if he addressed more needs of more than just the Democratic core constituency.
Right.
Did John Kerry do that?
No, I don't think John Kerry did that. I will say, I don't think John Kerry ran a bad race. And I think that one of the things we've seen since the end of the election is that the Democrats have not kind of pounced on Kerry in the way sometimes you would expect after a close losing race. On the other hand, I don't think that Kerry was ever more than sort of the generic Democrat. That unlike Clinton, he did not bring something to his candidacy which enlarged the Democratic appeal. He had I've rarely seen a case in which a nominee had as much solid support within his party as Kerry did, and so little enthusiasm for the candidate himself. And his inability, I think, to reach beyond the kind of basic Democratic message was part of the reason he was unsuccessful.
Could he have reached? There was nothing in his history to prevent him from reaching beyond, was there?
No, there wasn't, and there were times in his history, and I think times when he was getting ready to run for president, when he talked and sounded more like a New Democrat than he did in the presidential campaign. But certainly part of what happened was the phenomenon of Howard Dean in 2003, and the lesson that all the other candidates took away from that was that the angrier the better, the more anti-Bush the better, and that was important for Kerry in winning the Democratic nomination. You had to win that nomination first. But I never had the feeling that Senator Kerry and his team sat down at the beginning of the election cycle and said, what kind of general election do we want to run? What kind of general election message do we want to have? And how do we work back from that to win the nomination without compromising our ability to run that kind of campaign? I mean, if you look at what President Bush, then Governor Bush, did in 1999 and 2000, that's almost precisely what they did. They thought about how they wanted to run a general election and work back to figure out how they won the primary under those circumstances. And I think Kerry, in a sense, did it backwards. I think he was so focused, as were all the Democrats, on how do I win this nomination, that when they won the nomination, making the pivot to a general election campaign and a general election message was very, very difficult.
Sure. To be fair to Kerry, he had a tougher time winning the nomination in 2004 than Bush did in 2000.
Right.
Bush had some shaky times in the beginning, but it was pretty clear that he was the front runner, and Kerry had to mortgage his house and so forth and so on. He was close to dead.
Although, if you remember, at the beginning of 2003, there were a lot of people who thought Kerry was the clear front runner. And, he turned out, not to be as strong a candidate as some people had thought, and Dean obviously struck a nerve that a lot of Democrats, particularly in Washington, didn't realize was out there to be struck.
You mentioned that part of, talking about Kerry as a generic Democrat for a second, part of the problem was the primaries that he had to win. Now, the primaries do start in Iowa and almost seem to end in New Hampshire. Now, I was in Iowa once, and I've been to New Hampshire a few times, and I'm sure they look like America, but they don't look that much like where most of the people and even most of the Democrats live. Is that a losing hand for the Democratic Party to have to choose their presidential candidates starting in those two states?
It doesn't have to be. I mean, the arguments that you've laid out about the problems of Iowa and New Hampshire are certainly real. They're among the least diverse states in the country, and particularly for a party in which, the African American and Hispanic community is important to the coalition. The Democrats are starting in states in which those two communities, particularly the African American community, plays very little to no role. The Iowa Democratic Party has always had a very strong peace, anti-nuclear freeze, anti-Iraq war element to it, which forces candidates to appeal to that. But I'm not sure that you can say that the problems that Kerry had were a creation of what happened in Iowa and New Hampshire, or the voters that he was talking to. I mean, those in a sense are now national events. The debate that goes on is certainly to some extent localized, but it's also a national debate that's going on there. And I think that the advantage of those two states is that you have electorates that are very engaged and take seriously the responsibility to put candidates through their paces. And it's two of the few states where candidates actually have to talk to voters and listen to voters. And I think we've seen over the years, whether it's out of New Hampshire or Iowa, that candidates learn something from that process that's invaluable to them if they go on to become president, that they get a better understanding of real people than they do through what is essentially a TV or a wholesale campaign that happens after those two states. So I think to some extent there's a problem there with being pushed too far to the left if you're a Democrat, but I don't think that's the basic problem.
Now, if I were a pro-choice Republican, I might like the primary to be in New York or California, the first primaries,
right,
as opposed to Iowa or South Carolina. So it works on the other side as well.
It does. I mean, the Iowa Republican Party has had a very strong influence by the Christian Coalition back in the early 90s, and now pro-life or social conservatives. New Hampshire is a different animal. I mean, New Hampshire Republicans, a lot of the moderate Republicans have left the New Hampshire Party and are now independents, but one of the reasons John McCain did so well there in 2000 against George W. Bush, in addition to basically living there for most of a year, is that is a more moderate electorate.
State too, isn't it?
It is, yes. I mean, that's an open primary. Anybody can come in and vote. Independents form a very large portion of the electorate, and they can decide whether they want to vote in the Republican or the Democratic primary. And a lot of them voted in the Republican primary, and a lot of them voted for McCain.
Can a pro-choice Republican win the nomination?
Well, we're going to learn that in 2008, I think.
What's the name of the Republican who's going to try?
Well, it could be any number of Republicans. It could be Rudy Giuliani, or it could be George Pataki. But I don't know the answer to that, Doug. Certainly the conventional wisdom is no, that a pro-choice Republican can't get through that primary process.
2000 was a very close election. 2004 almost was.
Right.
About 3 weeks before the election, we had a dinner party at my house, and we happened to have 3 lawyers at the table, 2 Democrats and 1 Republican, and each one of them had their state, and bags packed and ready to go out there election night to fight the battles. Mm-hmm. Were we ready for it? Was this what was going to happen? Lawyers everywhere if it had been a closer election?
Doug, I think there were more lawyers with bags packed ready to go at a moment's notice in this election than we have ever seen before. I mean, each side was determined that they were not going to lose this election in the courts. That they were, if this was another disputed election, they were going to have all their forces ready. They were going to have all their arguments marshaled, and they were going to be ready to take on the fight instantly. I mean, there must have been 5,000 or 10,000 lawyers that may be an understatement, actually, assigned to different states, ready to go.
We would have done better assigning them to Social Security reform.
Well, or almost anything else, probably.
Well, no, I joked before about maybe the only fix for close elections is to win big, but it does seem as if we have not changed enough at the polling place level to avoid these problems in the future. I don't sense that the federal act has made that much difference at the local level. Have I got that wrong?
No, I don't think it has either. I have to confess, I'm not an expert on what has happened state by state on this, but I just think it's awfully hard to get to where we want to get to, a situation where we can count on the machinery that's there.
Not breaking after the party members vote.
Right, and that we can eliminate long lines everywhere, that we can anticipate how many people are going to turn out to vote.
One last question for me before we turn to the audience. Some of the solutions to the voting problem, it seems to me at least, or people I read, will change the dynamics of elections. The solutions being voting for a week or voting for a month, or I take it now very high levels of absentee balloting without having to be an absentee. And I must say I was tempted to vote a few weeks beforehand because I didn't want to face a long line. That changes the whole dynamic of a campaign, doesn't it?
It does, and we saw that play out in 2004 more than we've seen it before. I mean, it used to be that you get to the last few weeks of an election and you're basically in closing argument and you're trying to drive home one final message. And your get out the vote operation is geared toward election day and getting people to turn out on election day. But now what we've got is a situation in which campaigns have to be doing get out the vote for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, depending on how early voting starts or what the absentee voting rules are in a state.
And no closing argument.
And no closing argument. I mean, by the time you're making a closing argument, you may have lost 10% of the population, or 15, or 20, or 25. I mean, that continues to grow. And so the question of when you can finally lock in, or how do you build the momentum to get to election day is totally different than it was before we had these more liberalized rules on voting.
It will change things. I can remember, the conversations, well, one more week and Hubert Humphrey would have been president. I'm not saying it would have happened that way,
right.
But the polls were going that way. There was all this conversation about, well, just a little bit more, and, Gerald Ford, just a few more days, the polls were cut. That all will change.
It actually has changed. I mean, people still do kind of talk about that in that way, but the reality is that doesn't exist to the extent that it did before.
So campaigns then will get even more expensive.
Campaigns will, yes. I don't think unless you get public financing and public limits of presidential campaigns, you're not going to limit the amount of money that goes into them. And now, was 2004 extraordinary? Yes. Was it an aberration? I don't know. I mean, the amount of money that came pouring in 2004 was beyond anything that anybody imagined.
Especially the 527s, these special.
Well, partly the 527s that were created because they're the last receptacle of soft money, the big unregulated donations. But even the amount of money that George W. Bush raised, that John Kerry raised, that Howard Dean raised, far exceeded what anybody thought. I mean, and we now have a situation in which, at least under the primaries in the past, people basically took federal financing and stayed within limits and that sort of thing. But George W. Bush and Howard Dean and John Kerry have now shown that a smart candidate is never again going to take federal money because they want to be able to raise as much as they possibly can through the course of the primary process.
Yeah. And now, Dan, if it's all right with you, we'll take some questions from the audience.
Hi. I was just wondering the politicization of the Terry Schiavo case, where that comes from, and what that says about the future of the Republican and Democratic parties.
I think the desire to get into this is one more example of how values issues have come to dominate our politics in a way that they didn't 25 or 30 years ago. These are kinds of issues that in the past politicians would have run from rather than to try to get involved in. But more often today, politicians feel drawn to these, in part because they know many voters are motivated by what happens in this arena. What it means for the future, I would hesitate to predict. I've learned over the years that trying to project from the heat of the moment about anything like this, whether it's this kind of thing or impeachment politics or anything in which there is tremendous emotion and drama around it, it's almost impossible to predict the political significance or consequences of it. There are some people who think that this could hurt the Republican Party because, the public, if you look at the polls, believes that Congress was wrong to get involved in this and that people will take this out on the Republican Party. I'm not sure that that's necessarily going to be the case. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. But I think that it's reflective of a change in our politics and the degree to which values and cultural issues are now a much more significant part of the dialogue and the debate and the differences between the parties.
President Bush has made Social Security reform, particularly featuring private accounts, as the central focus of his domestic policy agenda. The Democrats up until now have chosen not to put a plan on the table of their own, and now the Republicans in TV ads are attacking the Democrats for not having a plan, when in fact the president has yet to articulate a plan of his own. If you were advising the Democrats what their next move in this chess match should be, what would you tell them to do?
I'm not in the business of giving advice to either party. I have written about the fact that there are Democrats who believe that the policy of just saying no, in this case, will be successful up to that point that President Bush begins to make a pivot away from his position. And that if the Democrats are not ready at that point to have something of their own on the table that they challenge Bush with, then they may be the long-term losers in this debate. If you talk to people at the White House about this, their view is as difficult as this debate has been and as difficult as this fight is and as tough as it now looks for President Bush to get what he has proposed, which is reforming Social Security by having private personal accounts as part of that solution. Their belief is that in the end this could be a win-win for the president almost under any circumstances, that if they get a bill, almost any kind of bill, he'll get credit for having pushed the political system to deal with the long-term problem of Social Security. And if they don't get a bill, it will be because in one way or another the Democrats blocked it, and that there will be a political payoff for the president, particularly with younger voters, they hope, for having done so. I think up to now the Democratic strategy has worked pretty well. They have made this a much tougher fight for Bush than he had envisioned, and I think that they're in the position now of saying we're going to ride this position for a good long time until we have to change. But the truth is, for the long-term aspirations of the Democrats, they've got to have their own platform, they've got to have their own agenda, they've got to have their own message on these things, and they don't at this point.
I'm wondering if you see any, now that it seems as though there could be a long-term Republican holding of power in Washington, any chance that the Democratic Party and the Republican Party will flip, and that the Democratic Party will, in fact, in the future, aggressively advertise itself and take a position in defense of local rights and states' rights?
I would be surprised if that becomes, a main element of the Democratic message. I think that the Terry Schiavo case is one in which the Democrats have used that argument conveniently to attack the Republicans, but mostly by saying the Republicans, you should be the ones who are states' rights, and here you're trampling on states' rights. I don't see it as something that is now widely infected the Democratic philosophy as being advocates of states' rights. One thing that does happen if you are in the minority in power in Washington is that governors tend to have a larger voice, or parties look to their governors to have a larger voice, and that's certainly beginning to happen within the Democratic Party, but there's always tension between the gubernatorial wing of the party and the Washington-based wing of the party. The interesting thing is the beginning part of your question, which is that under Bush, a former governor, there has been more usurpation, if you will, of the role of the states than we've seen quite a while. That during the Gingrich Revolution, there was much talk about devolution and giving power back to the states and letting states create solutions to policies. The Republican Party, in a sense, got itself a domestic program on the basis of what governors were doing in the states in the early 90s, which Bush then grafted onto his presidential campaign. But as president, whether it's education or homeland security or energy policy or a variety of other areas, he has in one way or another trampled on the wishes of the states, and it is a significant reversal. But I don't see the Democrats suddenly becoming the states' rights party in this country.
Well, on that note, Dan Balz, thank you very much for being on Policy Watch and being here at the University of Maryland.
Thank you, Doug.
This program was produced by the University of Maryland, which is solely responsible for its content.
The Norman and Florence Brody Family Foundation is dedicated to exploring topics of national and international importance and is proud to support Policy Watch with Doug Vesheroff at the University of Maryland.
We are PBS.